Homesteading the Moon, Claiming Property in Space. Now, I'm assuming you're here because you want to either study or write about it rather than actually being homesteaders. So if you want to actually do the homesteading part, maybe not be the kind of discussion that we have here. But just to introduce our other...
Okay, I'm Steve Setzer, and I'm a longtime space fan, particularly of private space enterprise, and I'm also an attorney, and in law school I actually did a couple of papers on the state of space law in mostly domestic, but also international, and the laws governing exploration and exploitation of space. So I think that's why I'm here.
Yeah, so the difference between us is I'm a writer, I just get to make things up. He actually does it more by the book and with actual rules and things.
But I've got a comment to that. One of the things to note is, before we even get into this, there's a whole lot of ambiguity and conflict here, which on the one hand means more billable hours for the lawyers, and on the other hand means more story ideas for the writers.
Now, we actually have a fairly small group here, so I'm going to make this a little bit more informal than you might see in some other sessions here. So if you have questions, just raise your hand as we're going. We'll try to cover them as we go rather than try to just save some time for the end. Yeah, if we end up with a large group, it usually works best to reserve some time, but I think we can just make this flow a little bit better if you just pop in with questions whenever you have them. Okay, one of the things I wanted to start off with is what laws, treaties, and rules really exist now. I assume there are a lot out there, but I'm not familiar with them. You probably know a little bit more about those.
So I can comment to that. There are some laws in the United States pertaining to Americans. There are also some international laws that govern how outer space is to be governed. And they were all these treaties, there are 4 or 5 of them, and they were all generated in the extremely optimistic, utopian late 1960s, early 1970s. And that will come out in my comments later, but the primary one that governs everything else is called the Outer Space Treaty. And that is signed by all the by over 100 countries, including all the spacefaring nations, which are the ones that really matter in this context. And Russia, as the inheritor of the Soviet Union's treaties, is a signatory to it. The United States, the member states of the European Space Agency. And the Outer Space Treaty basically says that limits or almost eliminates the ability of Earth-based nations to claim sovereignty over celestial bodies. Which is interesting, because part of the thing we're going to get into later is property. Well, how do you own property, and how do you enforce an ownership of property if there isn't a government that's going to respect your rights and adjudicate them against someone else? So we'll talk about that a little bit. The Outer Space Treaty, for you story writers, also bans the possession or use of weapons of mass destruction in space, but it does not ban the possession or use of weapons in outer space. So there should be some story thinking there. There is another treaty called the Moon Treaty, which you will run into, that's even more utopian and extends specifically to the moon, and no nation that actually fares in space has signed it. So it's completely irrelevant. About 100 nations have signed the Outer Space Treaty, about 18 have signed the Moon Treaty. And then there's a couple of subsidiary ones, like there's a Responsibility to Rescue Treaty. There's a little bit of unclarity as to whether you need to rescue the passengers or just the crew, because it just says astronauts. So there's some fun little bits there. There's a registration treaty that says if you put something in orbit, you have to register with the United Nations what its orbital characteristics are, give it an identifier, and a general statement of purpose. Like some of them will just say military with no other definition or whatever. But you are supposed to register every piece of junk you put into orbit. So those are the major ones.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, why has nobody signed the Moon Treaty?
It really, it's very, very utopian in that it basically, I mean, the Outer Space Treaty would already limit the ability of a nation to claim sovereignty, but it basically gets all the way into the kumbaya, anything you find on the moon belongs to everybody kind of thing. And I'm pretty sure that the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans all think that maybe someday there'd be something up there we'd want to keep. So.
So then the question becomes, what happens if somebody breaks these laws and these treaties? The enforcement between the larger nations seems to be more of a peer pressure kind of a thing, rather than saying, we're going to put the entire USSR or Russia in prison because they didn't. It doesn't work like that. So you have to have some way of enforcing these treaties and laws, but that gets into all of these nitpicky details as to, okay, how do you penalize countries for the things that they do?
And one of the distinctions you have to make is the difference between what a country does and what an individual does. So if the United States tried to claim sovereignty over, I don't know, a comet passing by, okay, we can't, and we'd get the peer pressure not to. What happens if Elon Musk flies up to the comet and
parks his car there?
And parks his car there. And generally in international law, in these international areas, a state that's a signatory to the treaty is supposed to enforce its terms against its own people in its own court system. And if there's a conflict between, say, like let's say Elon crashes his car into a Russian car that's also attempting to land on the same one, then there are things like the International Court of Justice, which can host lawsuits of citizens of different nations, but they can also use the court system of Russia or the US for that if they choose to. So it's kind of a multi-layer is the answer there for private parties. And for states, it really is the peer pressure thing. I mean, if Elon lands on a comet and we say we like that, and Russia and China don't complain, it doesn't really matter what anyone else says.
Yeah, so there's a whole area of law where, that doesn't really get enforced the way it's written. So the law tends to break down to whatever people don't complain about. And so it's kind of an interesting area. With space, it's one of those things that for a long time has been just entirely theoretical, but these days it's not out of the realm of possibility for a company to set up something on the moon. We've already seen private companies launch things into space, lots of satellites, things like that. It's not a huge step to assume it's more than government's involved here. The difference there is if it's a private citizen or a corporation, it's like you were saying, the enforcement varies a little bit, but it still is a matter of, what can you get away with? We've seen that in a lot of government issues where, the laws say we ought to do that, but that's kind of hard to enforce, and so we're going to just kind of turn a blind eye to that. One of the things I'm wondering about is if that's going to be the same way. If somebody decides they want to set up something on the moon, who's going to stop them? They have an obvious technological advantage to begin with. So where do you go from there?
It's interesting. A comparison I read, and I think one that would be worth looking at for writers, is to the law of the sea. Because the sea is a shared international resource, and the U.S. position, as articulated most recently in 2015, is that no one can claim ownership under current treaty of a whole body, but they can extract things from it or make things on it, and those are personally possessable. In the same way that I don't own the Pacific Ocean, but I can take my trawler out there and bring in 100 pounds of tuna. The thing that I find interesting there, as you start extending that, is, of course, space piracy is always fun. And the basic law of piracy is a member of any nation's navy can shoot a pirate on sight. It's nice if they give them a trial. And it's kind of up to the traditions of that particular navy. But simple trial and summary execution is still on the books. It's usually not how things are done. But that's a criminal act. For things like when two ships run into each other, or here's a bad one. When whalers are out hunting endangered whales, then it depends on, will someone with a navy and some power step up and enforce that? In the case of the whales, it often does happen. The Russians or the Americans will stop one of these groups from another one and take them into custody. But that's kind of how I think those are examples, good and bad, to look at. I mean, there are countries that look the other way when their own citizens are out doing environmentally damaging or illegal things, or even criminal things. I mean, I don't think there is a Somalian navy, but if there is, they sure don't do a very good job of anti-piracy work. That's kind of the model that I ran into getting ready for this panel that I think has a lot of value to it, but I'm not sure that other powerful signatories to the treaty accept that same model.
Kind of taking it along a different direction, homesteading is a whole different concept from a commercial entity landing and pulling minerals out of the moon. That changes the whole equation there, because homesteading implies permanence. A company, if they were to set something up, that's just a manufacturing facility. People might work there and take the really long commute back and forth occasionally, but homesteading really has a different feel to it. If you have people who decide that's where they want to live, that same idea of being able to be somewhere but not claim ownership to the thing that you're sitting on kind of comes into play there. But what does it take to be able to even get to that point, to say, okay, this is going to be a permanent fixture on the moon? You have to assume that anybody who can get there can pretty much do what they want and just have to deal with the penalties. But if they're up on the moon, what do you do about it?
That's a great question, and I don't have an answer for it. I'd like to throw that one out to the audience. What do you think? Let's go ahead and take that.
I just saw, I can't remember if it was on Amazon or Netflix, a show called Mars, where they actually kind of do a hypothetical of what it would be like in the future. It was like done by, it's all enacted, but they kind of try to put some of the actual technology and the actual fact behind it. It was quite interesting, but anybody out there, check it out. But they deal with this, where they have people going there to mine, and then scientists going there to look for things. And one's a company that's privately owned, another is actually from NASA, and how the dynamics work. It was quite interesting. They have their 2 seasons, 3 seasons, something like that.
What was it called again?
It's called Mars.
Is that the Nat Geo one? Was that Nat Geo behind that one?
Oh, no,
That was Nat Geo, yeah.
No. It's an actual, like a TV show.
Okay.
So let me tell us a couple, well, no, let's go ahead and, we had one over here and then over here.
For a historical analogy, the drainage of the Mississippi Valley prior to the Louisiana Purchase was sovereign territory of France. They had military forts to base all strategic ports of the navigable rivers, so they owned it, they were defending it. But by 1800, there were 10,000 families from the new American colonies who established themselves in the Ohio Valley. And that created an interesting problem. Because the 10,000 families, even if it was just one rifle or a shotgun per house, outgunned the French military. The other issue is that France, while they were extracting furs and trade from the local inhabitants, there wasn't a lot of immigration in terms of families going over to the drainage of Mississippi. Things were resolved by the Louisiana Purchase, where Napoleon, lacking funds, got some cash from the U.S. In return, we got more than doubled our size.
That's-
So, possessions 9/10 of the law.
That's an interesting thing, and an interesting question before we come back over to the other comment is, if during the time France was claiming sovereignty over the Mississippi Valley, two homesteaders got into a dispute over the border between their farms, who would adjudicate that? Because they were probably still American citizens. This is after the United States was established. Or perhaps we should say they were both citizens of New York State, or whatever, however they defined it at that point. Would they go back to New York to adjudicate it? Would a French court adjudicate it because the property that they both claimed ownership of was underlying that sovereign? I think France should adjudicate that, but it's a great question.
The parties might appeal to one authority or the other, but more often it was like Hatfields and McCoys. They settled it family to family, tribe to tribe,
Right. Well,
extrajudicial.
I'm not sure we want brawling in spacesuits if we can avoid it. Let's go over here and then
The question of like controlling space or celestial bodies. I mean, I think we kind of had the answer to that just with what's happening on Earth. We talked about the sea. And I think of China. I think of China seizing disputed islands. I think of China saying, no, it's not just 12 miles from our coast. We want the whole South China Sea. And we're going to intimidate U.S. destroyers and warships that are in the area. China has citizens in Taiwan that are loyal to China. We view that as a strategic relationship, and when we're ready, we're going to move on Taiwan. Russia has citizens in Ukraine. They're homesteaders in a way. When we're ready, we're going to use that to justify an invasion. So the questions we have in space, I think, are political, historical, human nature, and they're already happening on our oceans and in our country, among countries, and they resolve themselves differently depending on what country or political entity exerts power and influence to shape the outcome. So, there's no law in space. I mean, we can't even guarantee certain islands and certain territories are protected on our own planet. So, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves thinking we're going to control who has control over the moon. China starts colonizing it, and we don't have the resources to enforce a presence up there, then they're going to run with it. Unless we...
Or, by the same token, if we start doing things up there, planning people on it in a way that they don't like, and they don't build out a space capability, then we'll get to do it the way we want to.
Yeah, and homesteading is really kind of colonization in a way, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're talking in this case about bodies outside the Earth, so Mars, the Moon, and those colonies, Heinlein wrote a book about this. I mean, those colonies themselves, those homesteaders may decide to break away from their parent nation, just like America did a few hundred years ago.
That goes all the way back to the Greeks settling the Mediterranean. We had a question over here.
I was going to say one more thing, the Mars thing that I talked about, it's actually by National Geographic watching on Netflix.
Okay, thanks.
How does the Outer Space Treaty classify weapons of mass destruction? Is it just nuclear, or like with the harsh mistress where they were dropping asteroids?
Kinetic weapons would not count. It would classify weapons of mass destruction. I didn't read the details, but I believe it's how we traditionally do nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. So at least the U.S. has always, we haven't put any up, but there's been a lot of theory work done into kinetic bombardment, solid rocks or solid spears or whatever dropped from orbit. And the moon is a harsh mistress concept is the same. By the way, classic science fiction, if you don't know, you want to read 2 books by Heinlein from opposite ends of this problem. You want to read The Man Who Sold the Moon, who's the real inspiration for Elon and all the other guys. And then you want to read The Moon is a Harsh Mistress and learn what happens when people decide that they want to be sovereign themselves and not worry about what any Earth country is saying. You brought up an interesting thought to me too. I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot.
Go ahead.
Okay. We have international law of the sea, but it ends at an island. If there are people on an island already, international law considers that they own it. And, right now we're dancing around who owns some of these islands that are mostly uninhabited. And sometimes we override the locals own it theory anyway. But in general, the people who live in a place are considered to own it. Or the entity to which they owe loyalty is considered to own it. In outer space, the Outer Space Treaty appears to be saying, by defining this not only for the space in between things, but defining the bodies, it appears to be saying there is no sovereignty there. And then I think maybe that does bring up the, you didn't say these words, and you didn't say these words, but the might makes right kind of thing. If you can put yourself on a place and defend it, then you are the sovereign of it. Which is not necessarily the nicest way to settle things.
Yeah, but that does tend to make for some really interesting stories as well. One of the things that I was thinking of in preparing for this session is the idea that going into orbit has typically been very costly. I don't know if it's dropped from what I had heard several years ago, but like $1,000 a pound to get into orbit costly. I don't know if that's still roughly where the figure is, but some of the commercial entities may have been able to knock that price down a little bit. That is a pretty steep entry fee to get yourself into that elite group. If it's going to cost that much, that's going to influence who can be in space. You're not going to have vagabonds up there. You're going to have really, really rich people who have the ability to buy a lot of stuff to get themselves there and get themselves taken care of. And that kind of has an influence on what happens there, because these very rich people are going to have a lot of friends and influence that they have to be careful with, because not all of them are going to be up there. So there's this whole idea that it's going to be difficult to become that independent group on the moon just because of those financial, social, and political ties. But after a while, you start getting a generation up there, maybe a second generation. You're going to have a whole different class of people. It's not going to be all these billionaires that just have the resources to get there. You might have an underclass in orbit, but it's not going to be fast and it's not going to happen overnight. And so the idea of writing about these things, it's interesting to play with those ideas from a very numbers and crunchy kind of a viewpoint to make sure you can get those sorts of things right. The thing that makes a lot of writing interesting is to see when an author pays attention to the second and third order consequences of what would happen if this is the way things went. So there's a lot that you can kind of extrapolate from that, but it does really start from, yeah, the initial people out there are going to have a lot of resources to start with.
I love this, and I want to give you a couple of comparisons because they may not be their own resources. So let's look at the United States, or the American colonies from England, and let's look at two of them, Massachusetts and Virginia. Massachusetts was settled by moderately well-to-do, religiously oriented people who pooled their resources. The Pilgrims and the Puritans came from, they did not tend to have any of the nobility in them, very few, but they tended to be from a merchant, guild, moderately well-off, owning some property in England kind of class of people, and they were coming over to get away from their political and religious troubles in England. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony was very compressed that way. They didn't have very many rich, and they had almost no poor. Among other things that they did, they actually had, you needed to have reference letters and be able to prove that you could support yourself before you were even allowed to come over. It's one of the few colonies that had selective entrance requirements. Virginia was settled by, the settlement was led by aristocrats, generally second sons, who weren't going to inherit in England but had some money and some backing, and they brought over their whole retinue. So here's the boss, Lord so-and-so, Sir so-and-so, his wife, Lady so-and-so. And then everything from the people just below them all the way down to kitchen scullions. They paid for them to come over because they wanted to have the same lifestyle in America that they had in England, and in fact, they wanted to resist some of the equalization and liberalization trends that were already starting in England and establish more of a traditional aristocratic, I am the boss of the house. And so you had this very stratified society. This is not even getting to the slavery period. This is 40 years before there are any slaves in America. This is just English people with their servants. Then they do the whole indentured servant thing, and that's kind of like half slavery. Again, those are English people from the very poorest classes and the richest classes in the same place. And the dynamics of those two colonies and how they developed over the next 100 years. Because those are the same kinds of things you'll see here. He talked about very rich people settling the moon. Nowadays, most of our servants are electronic, but the extremely rich still do like to have their gardener and their babysitter. And at the same time, you might have another company, like a company that wants to exploit the moon's resources. Well, they're not going to bring up necessarily the junior people from their company, but senior engineers, senior technicians, people who are, again, much more like that Massachusetts Bay thing, a whole colony of engineers and technicians. And so those two dynamics, I think, will play out very interestingly.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is it might not just be those who have a lot of money, but those who have a lot of information will be highly valued as well.
Ooh, I hadn't even thought of that. That's a...
So
yeah.
The well-trained, highly skilled person who knows what they are doing, keeping something going on the moon is going to require a lot of very specialized skills. And so having that knowledge base as well as the funding is going to be critical. I was thinking about the difference between homesteading in American history. This is not going to look like Little House on the Prairie. But they will have to do a lot of the same sorts of things. You have to have some place to live that is safe and strong enough to withstand the environment. Just the idea of, well, what would a homestead on the moon look like? What would it have to contain? Because unless you are making regular trade runs, you have to be completely self-sufficient there. And that's a very difficult thing. They've failed at several attempts at having a self-contained, tightly sealed environment. And that's when there's easy access to all of the resources that they need here on Earth. And so, yeah, it's going to be very technically difficult to do this, but the idea is one that's so strong in the minds of people. It's been written about so many times that it's a lot of fun to explore. But again, taking those consequences into account of, well, what happens if you do this, and looking at all of the things that fall out from there. Somebody creates a self-sustaining habitat. Well, what if something goes wrong? There are all these interesting ideas to play with. And you put people into those situations, and that's where you develop that interest in a story where in the real world those things happen and it's disasters and it's on the news and people die and the flags go to half-mast. But when it's fiction and when it's stories that we're putting together, that's what makes those interesting, and that's what makes people want more.
And that circles us back around a little bit, I think, to the question of sovereignty. If you have your independent homesteaders, whether it's a big colony of unified group or a company town, or if somehow individuals manage to do it, and they run into trouble, and they call back to the country they came from, well, if you ask someone for help and they give it to you, then they own you a little bit. And the more help you need, the more they own you. So that comes back to, does an Earth nation, say a wealthy one like the United States, supporting, American citizens who are homesteading the moon, does it then de facto begin to exercise a sovereignty over there? Because you ask for help, your sealed containment burst. Well, the first thing you'll get is the U.S. Space Force coming up and helping you seal your dome. But then you'll get dome inspectors and regulations on the thickness of domes and so on.
Just the idea. Oh, you had a question over here.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a tangent, but so historically, settlement, homesteading, property rights have been used to promote exploration, but that's obviously, there's a conflict there with these utopian treaties. I guess I'm curious, like, what the pressure is like on those treaties now, if you guys have any insight on that. Especially with private companies increasingly getting into this sphere now.
One thing that comes to my mind with that are the XPrizes. If somebody were to generate one of those XPrize contests that had to do with settling a permanent establishment on the moon, that would be a real game changer if somebody was able to pull it off, and it ties back into all of those things as well.
Right now it's theoretical. I mean, everything that the private space guys are looking at doing is suborbital or low orbital flights, taking passengers up and taking satellites up. So it's variation on what we already do. It's just private entities handling the whole thing instead of part of it. So right now, the UN is a creation of governments. Therefore, it inherits all the slowness of governments. And so until someone presents them with the actual problem, I don't know that, other than a few people like us who like to think about these things, some of whom do work at the US FAA or at the United Nations Space Organization, they're not going to get listened to until someone actually does put an XPrize winner on the moon. And then the diplomats will wake up and start talking about it.
One of the things I've also been thinking about is if you have a base on the moon, if you have a permanent fixture there, are you going to have permanent residents, or are there going to be the regular traffic back and forth, which would be very expensive? How do you finance something like that? I'm assuming that if somebody wants to put a base on the moon like that, they would have a good reason to be there, something that you can research there. You have a question or comment?
Tourism.
Yeah, tourism is one that really doesn't require specific mining resources or anything there. Yeah, you just set up a hotel on the moon and people that have enough money will want to be there. So maybe that's how this will all start. You had a question in the back?
Yeah, I was just with if a government or a corporation could terraform or start planets Oregon, would they be able to expect that they could charge for colonists to go there, since they created the atmosphere and everything? Or?
Yeah, I think it plays back to the idea of if you can get there and you can hold on to it, it's yours. And so a lot of people are going to be willing to just sort of go along. The governments aren't going to want to put too fine a point on things, saying we're going to take this over from you, because the rest of the world would be up in arms over something like that. And so I think anybody who is able to pull that off, to set something up, to be able to use, for instance, processing regolith to pull out the minerals and things that they need to maintain a long-term establishment there. Yeah, they can do that. They can get away with it. And then it just falls back on some of the earlier discussions we've had about who do they call when they need help.
Right, although there's an interesting question, because you used the word terraform, and when we're thinking about pulling regolith from the moon and making an atmosphere, we're thinking about a small sealed area that you could control access to. But let's go the next step. Let's say company A, I don't know, crashes a couple of water asteroids and carbon dioxide asteroids into Mars and raises the CO2 level, and it starts warming, and then there's free water, so that you can actually live outdoors on Mars, okay? Company A put in all the investment to do that, expecting some sort of return. Then you get a free rider problem of company B says, well, I don't have any expertise in terraforming, but I can fly people from one place to another. I'm just going to drop colonists on this Earth-sized surface area, and you can't stop me because you don't have sufficient power to stop me. I mean, what happens? Does company A take a shot at someone else's spaceship full of colonists? And if so, that is when the regolith will hit the fan.
Yeah, it kind of opens up the whole idea of, okay, what do you do when you get lunar squatters? If somebody can put a self-contained base there by, say, manufacturing modules and just dropping them and connecting them, have the technology to make something that is self-sustaining, what do you do about it? Anybody who has the money to put one of those on the ground up on the moon can do so. It's going to turn into a matter of, well, you better play nice with the neighbors. And so it comes down back to, I think we just talked about that just as we were getting going, the idea of if you have competing groups up there, they better be ready to cooperate an awful lot as well. And so it may be, rather than falling back on government resources or corporate resources from Earth, maybe they just will depend more on each other, and doing that would generate more of an independent spirit, and it leads to a lot of these scenarios that we see in a lot of fiction where they decide, yeah, we're doing okay on our own, we don't need you anymore.
We have a question over here I'm going to take. Before I do that, I'm going to remind you again from American history. In 1620, you had Cavaliers settling Virginia and Roundheads, Puritans settling Massachusetts. In 1650, you had Cavaliers and Roundheads at war, and a king lost his head over it. And their American cousins were sympathetic to those causes. But in 1775, you had the descendants of Cavaliers and Roundheads getting together to kick all the other English out. Things change over time, and people who used to have conflict in a new area can find common cause.
Back to the rewriting company B and everything, the work together. McDonald's and Burger King have an interesting history in that very thing. Ray Kroc considered himself, the founder of McDonald's, a real estate agent more than a restaurateur. And McDonald's put in tons and tons of money to find like the perfect intersections and stuff to put a McDonald's. And it wasn't too long before Burger King realized, well, we'll just build near a McDonald's. They've already done the research and the demographics, and it worked. And intriguingly, generally, when there was another fast food restaurant as well as a McDonald's, both of them did better than if there was just one or the other.
Yeah, that really plays into the idea that if there's more than one group on the moon trying to settle it and make a go of it, it's a stronger situation than just one. The more independent groups you have, as long as they are willing to cooperate on things, the stronger you are. But it also brings up the point of, yeah, bad things happen if one of those groups decide they want to be the only ones there. So there's an awful lot more story fodder there. We have just a few minutes left, so we're going to go over some closing remarks, make sure everybody knows where they can find any of your things here or what other presentations you're going to be making, and then we will wrap it up.
I had one more thought. Don't assume that every colony in space will be from the United States, or will even be from one of the nations that's currently spacefaring. And, you know, you could end up in trouble if you had, for example, Sikhs and Pakistani Muslims building colonies near each other on Mars. There are a lot of conflicts on Earth that could lead to interesting changes or mutations in space. Do we have more questions?
Well, just to wrap things up, you can find my 2 fantasy novels and several of the anthologies that I'm in over in the dealer's room. The next thing that I will be involved in is a panel on the multidisciplinary creator. That's going to be at 3 o'clock down around in the smaller room end of things. And we really appreciate you taking the time to be here, and we hope this has been a lot of fun for you. And have a great time at LTUE.